Evening, everyone. Yes, thank you for the sound check. I've got the sound on, not been recording anything this week. Happy sort of period between Christmas and New Year. It's still technically, I suppose, Christmas. Um, so we're just going to have a little talk about some of the events that have happened this year, how it might impact on what will happen next year, because it's not a full circle thing, but I do find it quite weird that 5 years ago is when I was just gearing up to do the channel properly. The channel had already existed. I was putting all sorts of random nonsense on it, and it was basically late December 2018 when I thought, oh, I know what to do, and I was right, and I knew that it would work in 2019 particularly because I knew that politics was going to get very crazy. And in 2024, it is also going to get very crazy. Not in the same way, but politics, I think, is going to break quite badly in 2024 as well. I just think there'll be a better outcome at the end of it. However, let us discuss. We've got a Luke who's pretending to be Alan, asking about an article regarding Labour's position on English devolution. Should they get into government? He's saying, read a piece by Simon Jenkins in The Guardian, which he thinks Starmer may not be as pro-devolution as some think, which is a bit concerning for me. His view has always been. So I've read the article myself. I don't think he expresses that view. He just expresses the view that he doesn't think Labour are going to use councils right. But I can certainly answer the question from a hypothetical point of view. So what I would say is this. If you are a political leader, someone's mentioned, for example, John Cruddas, who's also written an article because he's plugging a book at the moment. What you're talking about here is a political leader who actually wants to win power. So they need a manifesto, not just to appeal to a core section of the public. There's a fundamental difference between like a range of offers that Labour or the Conservatives or the SNP in Scotland, for example, would have to offer, and ones that like Reform UK or the Liberal Democrats or the Green Party might offer. So the latter group of political parties can afford to focus on a very narrow section of society, which means it's really easy in two ways for them to present a coherent offer that they don't have to stray from very often. And it's because, first of all, they're targeting a very narrow range of people whose own views are very narrow. Second of all, because they'll never be in a position to implement these policies, it doesn't really matter if they're not all that thought through, if they're not well thought through. So Labour have to present, just like the Conservatives would when they want to win power, and SNP, Plaid, anyone like that in devolved parliaments or assemblies, will have to present ones that are going to appeal to a far wider range of views. And that sometimes means they will have policies that aren't going to be approved of by a certain section of their target voter, and there are other ones and so on. And as a result of that, you can't always be that coherent about them. So there's a lot of guesswork with basically Labour's policies. There's a lot of guesswork in terms of what's he really going to deliver. We know that we've got these policies. We know we've got these aims. Some of them are clear. There are some of them that are really clear. And there's other ones, and the devolution is one such one, is not that clear. But what I would say in terms of the logic is there's no problem with being sceptical. But I would say this, there isn't really a great clamour for devolution in England. There is a desire for greater devolution in Scotland, and I think Wales. Northern Ireland would just like their devolution to work. And but in England, there isn't really a groundswell of view. No, so when Keir Starmer has really been pushing this idea of, local decision making, he's not done it because, this is popular. Because that sometimes happens. Sometimes a political leader will go, okay, well, we'll have this policy because it's popular. I'm not really on board with it, but it's popular. That's not the case here. It's not. Which is why Labour hardly ever talk about it, which is also why we don't really have the details on it, because it's not a vote winner. It's not necessarily a vote loser, but it's not a vote winner, so they're not spending that much time on it. But what I would say is this: ask yourself why Starmer personally has got behind it so much. Why, for example, when he commissioned Gordon Brown to write that paper, which was far more wide-ranging than Starmer intended, why did Starmer organise this big press conference to talk about it? Because he personally wants it. But you'll notice they don't plug it a lot in their normal campaigning, and it's because it's not one of the main things to talk about for the election, because most people, you'll go, oh, you have local decisions made locally. And people go, right, okay, we don't care. Because people don't care. They just want the right decisions made. They're not really bothered whether they're made here, there, or anywhere. I think they should be made regionally, because ultimately the problem that Starmer's trying to tackle is if you have your investment decisions all made from Westminster or Whitehall in London, London's got a lot of advanced infrastructure. So you inevitably go, well, if we built this thing here where we've already got all this infrastructure, that'll give us our best return. So inevitably what you end up with is, if you're basing it on a pure cost return basis, you're going to still have the vast majority, and I mean the vast majority of all your investment are in and around London. So what Starmer wants to do is say, look, if we give people in the northeast decisions on like we give them pots of money, and like you make the decisions on how best to spend that money within certain like constraints, then they're not going to go, oh well, we should spend it in London, because that would be mad. Even if it would give them the best return, they'll think no, because we need it here. So that's how that will work. But there we go. So it's absolutely fine. Wherever there is a policy that is not absolutely crystal clear, it is right to be critical and to ask what exactly it's going to mean. Just don't expect to find the answer before the election if it's something that's not really worth talking about. And devolution, it's not. Even the last Labour government found that people in England weren't really that bothered about it. There were plans from the last Labour government to introduce far more devolution in England, and they found that in some cases, people were quite hostile. Now, you could argue that the way they intended to implement it wasn't right, but there it is. How do Labour laws change the media landscape, such as the BBC? Is there some semblance of news that's truthfully mainstream? Ultimately, it has to be with press regulation. And the thing is, with something like that, it's in Labour's interest to do it. There is the argument, will Labour really take on the media? Because the media will fight. I mean, if you look at what Donald Tusk is doing in Poland, for example, the far right, actually not even just the far right, just generally the right wing in this country, they're really up in arms about it, and they're trying to say, oh, this is what Starmer's going to do here. Now, I don't think Starmer is going to go that far that fast. I've kept saying, he should go quite slowly, but you need to move into a position where you can't just let people own whole outlets on their own, don't even live in this country, but it, in a way, doesn't matter where they live. Although it's a useful way to stop some oligarchs getting hold of the media if you say they have to be based in the UK. But it can't, I mean, with the BBC, you could say as a short-term fix, it's easy. The reason why the BBC is in the situation at the moment is because senior executives and guidelines have been set by the Conservative government. Well, all Labour have to do is change those executives and set different guidelines, and the BBC will churn out completely different content. Obviously, the rest of the right-wing media will then start saying, oh, Labour have taken over the BBC, it's no longer independent. I mean, you've got to bear in mind the Tories at the moment keep claiming that the BBC is this hotbed of wokeism, when they have appointed all the key people in charge of the BBC and set its guidelines. So, of course, when Labour in government, if Labour change even a single member of personnel, they will argue that they've taken it over and it's going to be a hotbed of socialism now, or Marxism. Marxism, that is their favourite word. So it has to be through regulation, ultimately. and I do want to see some. When will the manifest be published? When the election is called? Like Labour have had a manifesto. It keeps moving, but they've had a manifesto ready to go ever since the summer of 2022, because they didn't want to make the mistake that Labour made in 2017. So when it looked like Boris Johnson was going to fall, they didn't know that there would be any sort of smooth transition of power. There was a thought that it could, like we're looking at the same situation now, aren't we? You know, in theory, I think probably Rishi Sunak knows he's going to get his Rwanda bill through the House of Commons. But there is, in theory, a possibility that the right of his party will block it because they won't be happy with amendments. And if they propose amendments, the other Tory MPs won't be happy. So it is possible, possible that it gets blocked. And it is possible that they basically block the work of his government and he can't govern anymore. But rather than stand down, he calls an election. Now, there was the possibility that Boris Johnson could have done the same under slightly different circumstances. You know, so Labour have been prepared ever since. And they've said again recently, they have a manifesto, it's ready to go. If there were to be a sudden election called, but it does keep changing. So at the moment, I think the word is that Starmer's basically asked all of his senior leadership team to get their policies finalised for the first week in February. So it can then go through the usual mill. And so, because they're expecting Rishi Sunak to announce a general election at the end of March. So they're basically at the moment preparing for this May 2nd election. And then if it doesn't happen, then it'll just go through the usual process. It'll go through the NEC again later this year. But it is there. It is there in a workable format already. But we will not see it. I mean, we know some things that are in it. Things get leaked. But we won't actually see it until that election is called. Do Labour have to keep updating the manifesto? I wonder. Yes, they do. Consider that new restrictions get landed every day, it seems. Yes, they absolutely do. There's certain things that Labour must always do, regardless of the situation, if they want to win power. The first is, as far as most voters are concerned, the default position is that the Conservatives are the party of the economy, which is what allows them to get away with completely trashing the economy and saying, oh, it's actually not our fault. Actually, if Labour in power, it would be even worse. And people go, oh, okay. So Labour have to be able to like balance the books, as it's called. Whether they have to do that in power is another matter. But they have to make sure there's no daylight in spending plans. So they're constantly having to review those, because with every passing year, the Conservatives leave them in less and less room. Like if you look at the current plan, Jeremy Hunt, when he first made his budget statement after Liz Truss fell, Rishi Sunak was Prime Minister, and Jeremy Hunt, as his Chancellor, prepared his first budget statement. It basically said, we're going to borrow heavily for the next 2 years, and then we're suddenly going to cut public expenditure. And at the time I said, well, hang on, this is funny, because now what you're saying is you're going to borrow a lot of money, and they are borrowing about 140 billion a year. You're borrowing a lot of money each year. And then all of a sudden, after the election, which you're totally going to win, of course, you reckon you're going to be cutting public services that are already pared to the bone. So Labour have got a very tricky situation to manage. They are obviously not going to cut public services. But at the same time, they have to worry about the fact that what the Tories are going to do, when Labour in power, they're going to say, well, we had this plan to get debt down. Why isn't debt going down? Because it won't come down straight away, because Labour will aim to get that debt down with growth, which the Tories always talk about. But in order to, and Labour do keep saying things like, you can't just borrow your way to growth. You can't just spend your way to growth. And it's like, no, legislation helps as well. Yeah. Good policies help as well. But you do need the money. I can't like start I could start this business, but you can't generally start a business without some seed money, can you? You need to what's it called? You need to speculate to accumulate. So you do still need the funding. But there we go. Brian's saying that never get a Tory, never feed one after midnight. Anyone else old enough to get that? Yes. Everyone should be, whether they're old enough to remember it at the time or not. I'm saying that no, think it'll be May, but I honestly think they're a combination of stupid and delusion to the extent they don't think May would be their best time. So I am 100% certain that they think May will be their best time. That is not me saying the election is definitely in May. So let me just explain. There's two things that the Conservatives are doing which make you go, yeah, they're trying to get the election in May. The first is they're announcing, so nationally, they've already announced a 2% cut to national insurance. That is being implemented in a week's time, so that is coming in a week's time. And the idea then is, obviously, when that cut happens, most people don't see it. You don't see it until you see it in your wage slip. So you see it in the February wage slip, right? That's when you get your January pay. So they're expecting people to see that their take-home pay has gone up on their February wage slip and on their March wage slip and on their April wage slip. However, because income tax is going up, but they're not doing that early, so the national insurance cut is coming in January, but the income tax rise, the effective rise, is coming in April. So you'll see that in your May wage slip. So what's going to happen, not for everyone, there are some people who still gain overall, but what is still going to happen is people, regardless of whether they get a net gain out of this or not, and people on the lower end do not get a net gain out of it, they get a net loss. But everyone is going to see their take-home pay go down in May. Now, why would the Conservatives do that? Why would they introduce this national insurance cut in January if it means that come May, everyone is going to, well, not everyone, but, all types of voters, all demographics are going to see, the ones that are in work, their take-home pay go down in May? No, it's clear they don't want people to see that. So the reason they've put the national insurance cut in early is because they want to see people, they want people to see take-home pay going up. They don't want to see it come down again in May. So they want the election on May the 2nd before people start to see that. Then you've got Phil's got one here. Hello, Phil, not seen you for a while. What do Labour offer around the 50% of the Scottish population who vote on the single issue of independence? There is no such 50% who vote on the single issue of independence. There might be about 50% of voters who think there should be a referendum on independence or even would vote for independence, but they don't vote on that single issue. And that is a bit like saying, would you ever ask the question, what do Labour offer the whatever percentage of the population want to privatise the NHS? Would you ever say that? No, you wouldn't. That's a ridiculous question. The Labour have a certain ideology, a philosophy, and they work within that philosophy. And their philosophy is of the union. They are a unionist party, and that's what they work for. Now, I personally think that Scotland should have some mechanism, just like the UK had a mechanism to leave the EU. Scotland should have a mechanism to leave the UK should it wish. But that's my personal view. But it is not a Labour Party policy. And it may not be a Labour Party policy for some time. So, but that is, but Labour obviously do think that decision making should be made more regionally. So in other words, central decision making should only be where it is strictly needed for national cohesion. What was I going? Oh, so that was the first one. So basically, the fact that you've got this tax cut coming in January, but a tax rise coming in April means they want that May 2nd election. Or at the latest, it might be a late April election. I mean, there's an advantage in them having the election in April over May. But that's not the only thing. The second thing is this Rwanda plan, right? So Rishi Sunak, this is 100% well, 95%, I can't be certain. But I think 95%, this is what Rishi Sunak is telling his MPs, including those rebels who do not like his Rwanda plan. This will be what he's telling them. He's saying, right, here's what we're going to do. You're going to vote it through in the house, through the House of Commons, right? So that way we can say that the elected will of Parliament is that this Rwanda plan goes ahead. Then it will go to the House of Lords, where it will be delayed or blocked. We will then blame unelected Labour Lords for blocking the elected will of Parliament. And then we'll call an election where we have the Rwanda plan and challenges to the European Convention on Human Rights front and centre of our manifesto. So that, I think, is what Rishi Sunak's offer to his party is. And again, for that to work, he needs to call the election fairly soon after the Rwanda plan fails. Now, he's set everything up so that it's very likely to fall about March. Well, if you want the election on May the 2nd, you have to call it by the end of March. I've forgotten exactly what date it would be. 5 weeks before May the 2nd, essentially. I mean, you'll have to call it a little bit over 5 weeks because you'd have to dissolve Parliament 5 weeks before, and you have to give the King a bit of notice. So there's two things where Rishi Sunak is gearing up for announcing the election for May the 2nd, or potentially April. But I don't think that means they are definitely having the election, because there's another thing as well. So the Conservatives, and I did do this in a video, the Conservatives have said that they're going to be announcing their budget. I think it's March the 6th. I could have just double checked that. I'll just look at the dates. It's going to be a Wednesday. But the first Wednesday in March, March the 6th indeed. Now that is a little bit earlier than normal. Usually it's mid to late March they announce it. They usually only give a week or two's notice before the budget actually comes online. So you'd think, and it's not that it never happens. I mean, we had an early budget in 2021, but then you have to go a long way back before we had another early budget. So you think to yourself, well, what's that about? And what that'll be about is because if they need to announce, so let's have a look. So they need to announce the election at the latest on March the 28th. I think probably March the 27th realistically, but let's say March the 28th if they get the King moving pretty quickly. So then you say to yourself, okay, they think the budget is going to wow a lot of people. They're going to make it sound really nice, like, you know, the taps have been turned on again, the gold paving's going down. Never mind fixing the potholes, we're going to replace all that tarmac with gold-plated roads, right? Which would probably be horrendous to drive on, but never mind. Then they need to gauge public reaction. So I think they're announcing that budget early so that they can get a few weeks to gauge the public's reaction to it, to decide whether it's worth calling the election. Because if they do call the election on March the 28th, so that it happens on May the 2nd, by the time the budget will then come online during that election campaign when it's too late to do anything about it. If it goes tits up, they're in trouble. So I think they are trying to set up a landing zone for May the 2nd. I think that's clear. I think that's obvious. I don't think that's bluff. I don't think it's far too committed to make it a bluff. But I think they're giving themselves the option of October if it goes badly. So that's what I think. So I'm not saying it's definitely May. What I'm saying is they are definitely trying for May, but they're giving themselves a window to make their minds up at the last minute. You say, find it worrying that Starmer appears to be backing away from essential reforms, including the House of Lords, not a whisper on PR. This is vital if we want a functioning democracy. It is vital, absolutely. The House of Lords thing, he does want. But the thing is, like, you can't. The Labour leader is not the king of Labour. They can't, and when they become prime minister, they're not the king of the country. They're not an absolute monarch. They have to do things. You know, a leader leads by consent, and Starmer more so. Starmer actually has votes amongst his shadow cabinet for policies. He doesn't say, this is what we're going to do. There was like a criticism amongst Tony Blair's shadow cabinet and then eventually his cabinet that, some people would say he was too presidential. The opposite is the case of Starmer. There have been times where something's happened and it's like, and Starmer, you need to ask Starmer, well, what's your policy on this now? And he's delayed a few days. I'll give you an example. A couple of years ago, ahead of the local elections, when the Daily Mail ran that 2-week campaign about Beergate again. And so it was announced after the local elections that Durham police, or whoever it was, were going to investigate again. And so various journalists were asking him, well, what will you do if you're found guilty? And a few days later, he announced, I will step down. And I was thinking to myself, well, why wouldn't you just do that? It's an obvious thing to say. Why wouldn't you just do it? Why did it take him so long? The reason it took him so long is because he always seeks consensus. Apart from anything else, if he was going to say that, there would have been pressure on Angela Rayner to say the same thing, which she did. So obviously he had to sound her out as well, so he's not dropping her in it. But, Starmer is known for actually taking those soundings. Like, he doesn't just say, we're doing this because I say so. He actually does run a very, what you would call democratic shadow cabinet. So a lot of the things where he reins back, it's not because necessarily he thinks he needs to, but because his shadow cabinet are going, yeah, I'm not sure about this, in conjunction with strategists. The House of Lords thing is purely because there's massive resistance to it amongst Labour peers, as you can imagine. So they've not said, oh, we're not doing it anymore. Now, I do worry, don't get me wrong, I worry that it's going to end up, like when a new government comes in, there's always things they want to do that just get left in the in pile because it's never urgent. Do you know what I mean? When Labour come in, there's a lot of urgent things they're going to need to fix. And whatever they prioritise, whatever's not prioritised, people will moan at them about it anyway. Oh, why aren't you doing this? Well, it's like, well, they're doing all these other things. Oh, why aren't they doing that? Well, what do you want them to drop to do the other thing? I do worry that it is going to get left on the impale. I worry that there's a lot of people in Labour who don't want that because it's quite, for some of them, I don't understand why. I think being a peer is a shit job. Like, really, if you've made some money in politics, even the pay, because you have to turn up, you don't have to turn up to the debates. You have to turn up to Parliament to get paid. You don't get a wage. You get an attendance fee. Now, okay, you can spend all day in the cafe if you want, but that's crap. I don't think it's... But anyway, for whatever reason, some people like it. It's a nice little retirement plan for them. So there's a lot of opposition to getting rid of it within Labour. Just like there is, not as much as you might think, but there is key opposition to proportional representation in Labour. And that's the one that really has to be knocked in. That's got to be the priority, proportional representation. But I just think that replacing the House of Lords, I think a test will be, will he reform it in the first term? If he reforms it in the first term, then it can show intent to clear it out in the second. How likely are the Labour to approach the French about the offer to help us with migrant processing centres over there that the Tories refused? So, that's been topical recently, hasn't it? The idea of offshoring. Now, offshoring is a bit of a loaded term because it can mean lots of different things. Some of them are totally unacceptable, and some of them I'm actually in favour of. So let's go through the various types of offshoring. First of all, the Tories Rwanda plan is not really offshoring. It's true that when refugees are sent to Rwanda, assuming the plan goes ahead, they will be processed. But the idea is the ones who are successfully processed stay in Rwanda, and the ones who fail that process come back to the UK. So it's completely backwards to what people think. And I think the reason why Labour, which is very unusual, the reason why Labour are happy to talk about the Rwanda plan is because they know the public have got it backwards. They think that, or the sum of the public, should we say, the sum of the public think that the refugees are going to Rwanda just to be processed. And if they're successful, they'll come back. And if they're not successful, they'll be deported somewhere. But it's no. The successful ones stay there in the concentration camp. and the unsuccessful ones are the ones who come back, where we still have to process them anyway. It's absolute madness. So you could call that one type if you like, but I don't really class that. Another type of offshoring is where you send refugees to some far-flung place for processing, genuine processing, with the idea being that successful applicants are then brought to the UK. Now, I'm not in favour of that because that is just like, for example, there was one notion put, oh, well, we could set up a processing centre in like the Falklands. So like we're gonna fly people across the Atlantic to have be a centre in the Falklands, and then if they're successful, fly them all the way back. It's like, well, why can't you just have that processing centre in Dorset? And the reason is, of course, because it's like, oh, you know, it's like, well, we don't want to do that because then it's we're smoothing the troubled brows. But the problem with a far-flung processing centre is it's like, how are you going to make sure that the applicants have got access to legal and translation services then? You can't have all the infrastructure set up there. So that doesn't work. Another possible type of offshoring is where you have offshore, if you have processing centres in stable countries, but around the trouble spots. So maybe you have a processing centre in Turkey, for example. The idea there is that the thinking behind it is you then, those who know they can just go to this processing centre in Turkey do not have to fall foul of the people smugglers who will just take them across Europe. It's like, we'll just go to Turkey, and you know, which is sort of next door anyway, and there's a processing centre there. Again, problems with that is, would you have all the full access to legal advice? And the other problem with that is, so imagine processing centre in Turkey for people coming from Africa, is you'd say, so, okay, so genuine asylum seekers may then go, oh, there's a processing centre in Turkey, we'll go to Turkey. And that's fine. But then there was no disadvantage in them then going to the north of France, say, for one. But any ones who aren't genuine, because some of them don't pass the application process, so they can be considered to be illegal immigrants, if you like, they're still going to go through the people smuggler route, aren't they? So it doesn't actually really cut down too much on that. Then your next type is the north of France model, which is the one I favour. It's the only one I favour, which is where you go, look, if there's a lot of people congregating there anyway before they pass to the UK, why not set up a processing centre? France are fine with that. They're cool with that. We can also make sure they've got access to legal representation and translators. You can make it, I mean, they'll be detained there, but you can make it comfortable. It's not a pissing plague barge, you know, and I see no problem with that. You know, you can even say, if anyone does cross over into Britain, you could just say, right, well, you're claiming asylum, so we'll take you to our asylum processing centre in France. And that way you can tell the public, no asylum seeker comes directly to Britain unless authorised to do so. You can then, at a stroke, claim that you've cut down all the illegal immigration, at least from this source. Doesn't mean there's no one sneaking on the back of a lorry. So I'm fine with that. Again, it's going to cost more than just setting up that processing centre in like Kent or Dorset or something. But if that sort of smooths the brows, it's not inhumane. Asylum seekers are still getting their claims processed properly, they're in safe conditions, and they have access to legal and advice and translators. That's fine. Then there's your final type of offshoring, which was made famous with the National Archives release this week, which is where you stick them on some far-flung island off the coast of Britain. I think Mull was the one that was newsworthy this week. That's a nonsense. That is a nonsense, because what you're basically saying is we don't want these people in Britain, but it's like, it's fine for them to be in the UK, but not in Britain. That's just weird. And it was quite funny when I saw the comments reported that, was it Tony Blair had said, someone in his government, anyway, it might have been Blair himself, had said, They eventually didn't do that, and they said, "Oh, we'd have NIMBY objections." And I'm thinking, well, okay, yeah, but it's a NIMBY attitude that means you want to do it in the first place, isn't it? Because why would you transport asylum seekers to an island off the north coast of Scotland when you can just have a processing centre in the south of England? Why? Because you don't want them in your backyard. So those are the different types of offshoring. There's huge differences between them. I am fully in favour of, like, what's with the Henge and Motley Crue. I just thought, it's not quite Christmas, but it's sort of winter solstice time. So I just put Stonehenge there. And then these are all the sort of people that have been largely making the news this year. They're not all motley. The French government, the men and the population of Calais and the French immigration service would build a processing centre tomorrow if asked. The thing is, we are actually building a facility in the north of France, but it's purely intended as a detention centre, not a detention and processing centre. So we already have the go-ahead to do that. We're already building something. It's just intended as a detention centre. And it's like, well, what happens when it gets full then? Because we're not intending to process them. We just detain them. Like, why? It's absolute madness. Yeah, it costs more because we're paying another government, local and national government, to allow us those facilities, and there'll be extra travel for, lawyers and translators and border staff and so on. So it would cost us more to put it in the north of France. But do you know what? I don't think the British public would have a problem with it. I think they would quite like it. So I'm fine with it. The asylum seekers are still being treated with respect if it's in the north of France. Why not? And then the idea is, if the application is passed, according to Home Office figures, about 3/4 of asylum applications are successful, then they can be brought to Britain. You say asylum seekers isn't even top 5 issue. It is a top 3 issue. You're wrong about that. It's a top 3 issue. And for Conservative voters, it's the top 1 issue. After who came after him before, I think May might be the best PM we've had since 2010, which is really depressing. I'm not really sure I would say that. I can actually come up with, like, I have a what's the opposite of a soft spot, a hard spot, I suppose, for David Cameron, because he did kill a friend of mine. But he did do some things that were, you could say, well, that was good. If you hadn't done all the evil stuff, that would be fine. Whereas Theresa May, I can't think of anything that she did that was laudable. I mean, we'll just talk about immigration. She's literally the author of the hostile environment. I can't actually think of anything good that Theresa May did. Whereas David Cameron, he at least tried to warn the world about the coming pandemic. He did make sure it was clear to his government and other governments around the world that we need to prepare for it. The fact that his own party completely ignored him when he left power, there's also the fact, I was talking about this in the Labour Social stream last night, the reason why the Conservative Party have more of a sort of diversity, ethnic diversity, not diversity of thought, unfortunately, but ethnic diversity in their ranks now, is because David Cameron said, look, we're far too white. And in 2015, he made sure there were a lot of candidates from different ethnic backgrounds and in winnable seats as well. He specifically said, I don't just want these in the crap seats just for a tick box exercise. So, he has done a few useful things, David Cameron. Theresa May, I honestly, if you can give me one, fine. I cannot think of anything. Should Starmer offer an olive branch to the Corbynites post-election? You want as many allies as possible, but the thing is, you're talking about people who from this before he'd even been elected leader were attacking him, and they've consistently attacked him before he did anything, before he set out anything. Attack, attack, attack. These are people who think this is what should happen. This is the way they imagine this country. If they could design a country from scratch, this is the way it should be, and everyone will be happy and all the rest of it. And, you know, in many ways, I agree. But if you tell them, well, actually, most people don't agree with you, so it's impossible for you to implement this utopia. So actually, what we need to do is to compromise. They go, we don't compromise. Compromise is the language of weakness. These people cannot, you know, they cannot. They were even offered, I mean, you say offer an olive branch. He tried to recruit several senior members of them into his policy groups. Wouldn't touch it. John McDonnell, you would have thought, he is the most reasonable of them. Refused. Point blank refused. There's nothing you can do for these people. Absolutely nothing. They are, you know, they are incredibly unpleasant people. I think at one time in the past, they had some nice ideals, but they're such hateful monsters. We can see the results of May in a reaction to immigration, the Democracy Museum in Manchester. Oh, I've not been there. But I cannot actually think of any. The only reason sometimes we sort of think more kindly upon Theresa May is because, you know, we compare her to like Boris Johnson, particularly, and think, well, at least she didn't want to completely destroy the country. But at the same time, she's very much like Margaret Thatcher, in that you can say that she genuinely wanted what's best for the country, but she didn't really have any regard for its people. You know, there's like this. I often used to think when I was observing politics as a young boy, basically in the 80s, as I was growing up, you could often see the difference between Labour and the Conservatives being that Labour felt that the nation should be strong at the but you know, at the cost of its people. It was quite clear that the Thatcher government had no regard for the people, and that her attitude to the people was they had to give their service to the country without any thought of like getting anything in return. Whereas Labour were much more of the purpose of the country is to empower the people, even if that means that the country is weaker because of it, the people should be stronger. So it was like, you know, if you think of in terms of the national cake, the Conservatives prioritised the size of the national cake above all else, even if it meant the vast majority of people only got a little bit. Whereas Labour's attitude is that everyone should have a roughly equal share of the cake, even if that cake overall was smaller. Whereas the Conservatives now, it's like sod the cake. They don't care about the cake. In fact, they want all the cake. They don't care how small it is. So they don't prioritise the size of the cake. They only prioritise the fact that they have all of it. Cameron also promoted Moan to the House of Lords. I mean, he will have promoted a lot of people to the House of Lords as well, because he was doing what Starmer will do when he comes to power. He was packing it out with Conservative peers, because what happens is neither Labour nor the Conservatives, of course, have a majority in the House of Lords. But when Labour have been in power for a while, as they were last time, there were more Labour peers going into the Lords than Conservative peers. And then obviously the Conservatives have gone the other way around now. They've been absolutely jamming it full of Conservatives, like never before. So Cameron was just doing that. He was just, in his mind, rebalancing things and packing it out. It's a bit like with the Supreme Court. In fact, the House of Lords is basically our version of the Supreme Court, isn't it, in America, where they just pack it out with their own. So I won't attend a Socialist Workers' Party meeting, Phil. I'd be more than happy to. I don't think they'd want me to. And in actual fact, there aren't any around here. Should Labour's next leader be a woman? Labour's next leader must be the best choice, but there will be some useful choices. It's one of these things. You look at it, and you can look on an individual basis, and go at the last election, for example, there were several female contestants in the leadership contest, but Starmer was the clear standout. But there have been times in the past when that has not always been the case. I voted, for example, for Yvette Cooper when she stood. But that is what should happen. You can't afford, just for the sake of it, to appoint a woman who then ends up being a strategic idiot. But there are plenty of women in Labour who could do the job, I think, after Starmer. So it may well be that does happen. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Yeah, I think it needs to be both, really. Because otherwise you end up with basically that, although that phrase is lauded because Kennedy said it, it's basically an American version of Art Bike Mac Fry, isn't it? Which is never a good look. It's like, no, yes, in the interest of national cohesion, it's really good if people do feel a sense of duty, but it has to work both ways. You have to ask, what are the people, for example, when we say in this country, oh, we're like the 6th largest economy, used to be 5th, but we're the 6th largest economy. It's like, great. What do the people get out of that? Are the people of this country, the ordinary people, do they have the 6th highest income in the world? No, they don't. So what good is it? Chances Sadiq Khan could progress to Labour leader one day. I would say slim, because he's not in Parliament for a start. At the moment, as long as he keeps winning elections, he's going to continue to be the Mayor of London, isn't he? And at some point, he's been... Not many people return to Parliament as well once they've left, because it's an horrible place, really. Whenever you've got someone who's been in Parliament and been on the wheel, and they leave it, they escape. Like Ed Balls, for example, doesn't even contemplate going back. You do find that a lot of people, some people will just leave Parliament. Some of the people who are stepping down because it's horrible. And that happens to a disproportionate number of women, because it's particularly horrible for female MPs. But you also get some people who are sort of forced out of Parliament because they lose an election. And very often they decide they don't want to come back. Some do, but very often they decide they don't want to come back because it's so horrible. Anyway, a first step to reforming the Lords is to get each appointment passed by 2/3 majority in first past the post or half in PR. Now, my issue is I don't actually know how you reform the House of Lords. I have thought about it a lot, and everything I come up with. So I'll tell you, here's my issue with the House of Lords as it is. For many years, I had no problem with the fact it's unelected, because all it is a revising chamber, right? Its job is to look at legislation and go, look, right, if you do this, then this will happen. You don't really want that. Here's a suggestion for an amendment. And then if the House of Commons goes, no, we're happy with it the way they are, the Lords usually go, all right, then, if you're sure, but don't say we didn't tell you. Now, for that, think about who should be in the House of Lords to do that job. So you've got people who have been experienced MPs, because they are used to reading, particularly if they've been experienced ministers, because then they're used to reading legislation. You can have senior judges or lawyers, right? Because they're obviously used to reading legislation. You can have senior and experienced members of trades unions, because they're used to reading legislation. You can have senior business leaders, because they're used to reading legislation. So you look at the various types of people who should make up the House of Lords as being people who have the experience of scrutinising legislation. But what's happened, and I'm not saying this wasn't happening in the past, but what's happening too much now is you've got people going to the House of Lords who have no skills for. They're just been sent to the House of Lords to vote a particular way. They've been sent there to vote along party lines, regardless of the legislation. And that is not, you are not then doing your job as a revising change. You're not scrutinising legislation. You're just waving it through. You're like a checkpoint border guard, just waving everything through. There's no value in you. There's no value in doing that. So that's why, for me, it's because you think to yourself, is there a way of making sure you can only get people with certain skills and experiences into the House of Lords? And I'm not sure there is. And that's where it falls down. Because if you do something like, say, you can only come from these sorts of backgrounds and we're going to limit the numbers, then as soon as, it'd be like the Supreme Court in the US, as soon as one party gets a load of their people jammed in because they've been in power for a while, it's like, because it's a position for life, you can't shift them. You know, but then you wouldn't want to go the other, because then you might say, well, what if you had, instead of a position for life, what if it was for 10 years and then after, and you couldn't be reappointed to the House of Lords? But then you might have really experienced people, really good people, who are then just going to have a 10-year stint and that's it. I don't know. I don't know what the answer is, which is why I'm now even though I used to be of the view it's fine being unelected because all they do is revise legislation. I'm now of the view it's just broken. The Boris Johnson in particular has completely broken it. And it was always used in the past as well for like favours. I mean, Labour and Conservatives have both done this. You know, they put people in the House of Lords as a like, well, if you keep quiet about this, I'll stick you in the House of Lords. So there's always been a little bit of, you know, using it as a reward for silence in politics as well. So I would just say it's just knackered. Just get rid of it. Get rid of it. Someone's mentioned Ian Botham there. Yeah. What does he know about scrutinising legislation? Bog all. Bog all. There's so many of them now as well. If it was just the odd one, you would, like, if it's the odd one who's done a lot of charity work or something, you go, okay, well, they might have something useful to say on this or that. So you can have the odd one like Ian Botham in there, but there's just so many. There's so many, and it's and I've not seen, and there are people very genuinely who don't want to see it removed. They want to see it reformed, and I've sometimes read them, like George Perrotts, for example. Casey, some people may know, is one such person, and I've sometimes read his stuff, and I've gone, but that won't work. You know, you've got to apply a test to it. You've got to now work on. There was a time when you worked. You know, it's called the good chaps theory of government, which has broken down this idea that we know politicians are not exactly honest and decent and all the rest of it, but that ultimately they felt a sense of duty to their country. So our sort of system of politics has worked on the basis that ultimately the majority of MPs were essentially decent, you know, in very general terms. We now have to come up with systems that work on the opposite assumption. We now have to come up with systems that assume that actually the majority of MPs could actually be self-serving arseholes. And that's what we need. We should have senators. Well, I mean, this is part of the plan, isn't it? That Starmer wants. That he wants an elected chamber that's decided regionally. So, you know, so they represent the whole of the UK. That is the whole point. Whereas the House of Lords doesn't, because that's another problem with it. The vast majority of people in the House of Lords live in London because they're the well-to-do. They're retired politicians who just live in London or in or around London, or they are, if they're senior lawyers, they probably live in London as well, because why wouldn't you? Or business leaders, same thing. So there are members of the House of Lords who are from far-flung places in the UK, but it's not representative of the UK. So many problems with it. And it's very difficult to see how you reform it. And I have tried to read from some people who think it should be reformed rather than replaced. And every time I see a suggestion, I think I try and imagine how someone like Boris Johnson would just ignore or subvert it. And if you can think of a way, then it's not going to work. You say the 10 years seems reasonable with option for renewal. Just think the selection process needs to be a bit less partisan by using 2/3. This will reduce the ability for corruption. It could, so if you're talking about like having a sort of cross-party select committee or something, possibly. But then what? So you would still need a fixed term for them though, because what if they just wangle their way through that select committee, certain things aren't disclosed to them, and then they've got their seat, so. But there you go. Wasn't Brown meant to be advising Starmer on House of Lords reform? Well, he produced a paper, so yes. But again, the reason why that's been shelved for the first term, I hope it hasn't been shelved, I hope it just means they're doing something else first, is really just because there's this fierce resistance within Labour. And like I say, ultimately people will blame the Labour for every decision, the leader, for every decision, which is fine, people can do that. But ultimately, this is something that Starmer genuinely wants. But he cannot just snap his fingers and say, bring me this thing. If it was as easy as a Prime Minister to snap his fingers and say, do this thing, then we would have a roundabout underneath the Isle of Man now, because that's what Boris Johnson wanted. Oh dear, no, Matthew. We should have an elected head of state who can veto legislation from an out-of-control government. No, because then what if you've got an out-of-control head of state? It's much easier to get an out-of-control head of state than an out-of-control government. A government for a government to be out of control, you need hundreds of MPs to allow it to be out of control. For an elected head of state to be out of control, you don't. You just need one very popular person to get elected by the public. Someone like Boris Johnson. I mean, he's not now, but he was at one time. There was a time when Boris Johnson could have become an elected president and he would have been out of control from day one. So no, I am absolutely dead against the idea. And I know there are some countries where they're happy enough with it, but the idea of a single elected person being able to veto, you're talking about one elected person being able to veto what 350 elected people are saying. That's no. Far-flung parts of the UK like Siberia. Yeah, Lord Lebedev of Siberia, indeed, yes. That was a complete piss take. I cannot... If Labour had done something like that, it wouldn't be possible to stick. The media would be all over it. They'd be describing it as a national humiliation, which is what it was. Every example you have was of people who had experience of scrutinised legislation, so not scientists, medics, educational ethicists. Well, in terms of my original plan for the House of Lords, so if I were to design an unelected revising chamber from scratch, I've said this before, I would actually have two parts to it. So I would have a section that could vote on legislation, which would be elected. So you'd have elected peers who can vote. But then I would have various experts who formed part of the chamber just merely to take part in debates. And then it would include people from various professions as well. But the other thing, in terms of, you say not scientists, medics, educational ethicists, things like that, those are invited to discuss legislation at the committee stages of both the House of Lords and the House of Commons. So they're not excluded from the process anyway. So in both the House of Commons and the House of Lords, as a bill passes through Parliament, there's a committee stage after the second reading where you invite people who are experts on it. So they get those views anyway. You just don't need them to vote. Many moons ago, I worked for the Foreign Office. After so many years, people got automatic promotion. It's Buggins' turn, isn't it? It's known as. Worked for some very stupid people. Hopefully that has changed now. It hasn't. It may have changed. It may not have changed for the better. I'm not going to the House of Lords. I have no experience of scrutinising legislation either. I occasionally look at it and do a video on it. It's not quite the same thing. If Starmer holds a referendum on demolishing that, I mean, no, we shouldn't have referenda at all. We're not set up for it in this country. But anyway, does it obligate his party to follow through with it, given the vote is a yes? So it very much depends. Something like, should we, like, if you just say, should we get rid of the House of Lords, then no, because it's like, well, what do you do then? Like, you know, you've got to say what replaces it. So the reason why the Brexit referendum was very unsatisfactory, apart from the result, was because, well, you didn't say what we replace it with, as if it's a binary thing. Whereas if you present a paper that says we want to get rid of the House of Lords and replace it with this chamber and this is how it will work, then you can make that referendum legally binding. You've already got the bill set up. It's there. So if you wanted to have a referendum for that, you create the bill that explains how that process is going to work in detail, and then put it to the people. And if the vote is yes, then it can automatically go through Parliament, which is the best. If you are going to have a referendum, that is the best way to do it, to have the legislation already worked out in advance so that everyone knows exactly what it means. But I would avoid any sort of, I would avoid referenda at any cost, because we are not set up for them in this country. We don't have a system of invalidating them if they are like carried out unlawfully, even. Like the High Court said of the Brexit referendum, the reason why they would have struck it down if it were legally binding, but it wasn't. But nonetheless, MPs behaved as if it was. And the public were told that it was. And it was all lies. So we have a system where lying gives you an advantage in a referendum campaign. So we should not have referendum campaigns while that exists. Have I ever thought what would happen if they privatised the House of Lords? They already have. It is privatised. So, you know, like, for example, there was this thing a few years ago when it was discovered that the Conservatives were putting a succession of party treasurers into the House of Lords, and it transpired that what the deal was this. A Tory donor would become the party treasurer. They would have to donate at least £3 million to the Conservative Party. Then they'd remain treasurer for about a year and a half. And then they would stand down and get a seat in the House of Lords. That is privatisation of the House of Lords. That is literally paying for your seat. You know, there are numerous party donors in the House of Lords, and most of them are Conservatives. What about an elected head of state like the German president, limited power? So in terms of that, so as some people may know, we'll have to make this the last one, sorry, because we have run out of time now. As people know, I am in favour of constitutional monarchy, and my reason for that, really quickly, you've got someone who is basically just a diplomat. They don't, and they shouldn't. I know some people say, oh, you know, but the king or the queen before him could actually look at certain bits of legislation, and certain types of legislation they could almost veto. Yeah, remove those powers, take away those powers. They are useful as basically a diplomat. They're a super ambassador. And having someone who's basically trained from birth for that role is incredibly useful. So in pure diplomacy terms, they're really good. Just don't allow them, you know, if there needs to reform something, if you need to say, look, they shouldn't be able to do this, that, or the other, or, you know, look at legislation that can impact them financially and have a say in it. Yeah, get rid of that. But other than that, constitutional monarch is quite suitable. However, it's not something I would like cry about if we changed the system and became a republic. It's just something that I lean more on the side of, yeah, constitutional monarchy, quite good. But if we were to have an elected head of state, I would still want them to have a largely diplomatic role. I wouldn't want an elected head of state to be able to veto anything that the House of Commons came up with. That's not right. Because again, you're saying that one elected person has more power than 320 odd elected people. No. Even though the one elected person will have been elected by the entire country, I appreciate that, but no. We won't have that. So yes, if you a head of state, I think should just be diplomatic. They are an ambassador. They can be a functionary, signing bills into law. But the problem with an elected president is then you have a situation. They will demand, well, what are my executive powers? They will want executive powers. If you're going to do that, you might as well have the American system, where you have, in some ways, maybe we would be better with something similar to the American system, where you directly elect the government, the head of government, because the US president is head of government and head of state, and then you separately elect the legislature. So maybe that would suit us more if we're going to be a republic. I think that's a better system than, say, the French system, where you do directly elect the president, and then the president appoints a prime minister who may or may not have the support of Parliament. It's a bit mad. So no, but there we go. We'll have to leave that there. Thanks very much for coming on, everyone. Have a happy New Year, because it will be the new year when we come back. Have a good evening, and until next time, I'll see you later.